Hi everyone, my name is Erin Hayden. I am a pharmacist at Altman Hospital. I completed my doctorate of pharmacy at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, and I completed my residency as well at Altman Hospital. And today I currently serve as the IV room and medication safety coordinator for the hospital. And part of that includes helping with the vaccine effort that we're currently part of. So we thought this would be a great topic. Everyone has a lot of questions, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can. So I first wanted to start with a disclaimer. Just in general, this is not meant to give any advice or any medical advice. Everyone should consult their physicians if there's any questions concerning their ability to receive the COVID-19 vaccine. So I'm here to present the facts for you, and hopefully I can get some questions answered, some clarifications for you. So first, I wanted to start with some background. So what is coronavirus? A lot of people think it just kind of turned up now, but the actual reality is that we've had it for quite a while. So it's been around for decades, at least 1960s as far as testing goes back, but it seemed to probably be around centuries that we've actually had it around. And coronavirus itself is actually just a mild upper respiratory infection. Some of them can include some stomach issues, so maybe an upset stomach, but most of the time, fairly mild. We kind of group it with the common cold. Something with this, though, is that there are certain strains. We may see some certain strains that we see in humans and some in animals. So the ones that we see in humans are the alpha and the beta strains. And these are, like I said, a very mild upper respiratory infection that we see every year around flu and cold time. And that we see people, they can be admitted to the hospital, but a lot of times it's just something like the common cold. So a lot of you may ask, well, how does something like the common cold turn into a pandemic like this? So basically what happens is we have mutations from animal variants to humans. And this can happen a number of ways. And it can happen through a number of animals. And it can happen if the virus jumps from an animal directly to a human, or maybe there's an intermediate species where the typical animal that maybe holds it then is eaten by another animal, and then we eat that animal. So that's something where there's some sort of intermediate food chain happening. So typically, though, these mutations that live in animals, they will stay in animals and they'll mutate in animals and they'll stay there forever. However, sometimes a rare mutation can happen in that animal and it will jump to a human. And so when that happens, we see things like these pandemics. So the origination of COVID-19 is possibly originated from bats. Even now, a year later, we're still not sure where exactly this came from. Originally, bats was the suspicion. It moved to an anteater that they have in China. So this originally came from Wuhan, China. A lot of experts surmise that it came from their fresh markets. So what happens in these fresh markets outside, it's open air, the animals are being slaughtered fresh there for people to come and get for their families and cook. When this happens, you have lots of animals who are being slaughtered at these markets. They're intermingling, these viruses are jumping from one animal to another. And eventually it can jump to a human. So this is possibly where the virus could have started. And when you're looking at things like this, you're looking at animals like bats, cattle, even things like for the flu, you're looking at things like birds, as well as camels. So coronavirus itself in a pandemic portion is actually not new. So COVID-19 is not our first coronavirus that we've had. So this is considered similar to MERS and SARS. So I don't know if many of you remember back in 2002, 2012, we had an outbreak of SARS and MERS. So you can see here, this was back from 2002, SARS came around, and it was something that we saw and everyone was worried it was going to be a pandemic. Now, just because it jumps from an animal to a human doesn't mean that it can stay in a human. They're not always able to do that. And what happens is it can be the season, it can be other human pathogens that are able to fight it off. It can be that our genetic sequence itself can kind of mutate and overcome that. So when you look at something like SARS and MERS that occurred, so severe acute respiratory syndrome happened back in 2002. Around 8,000 people were infected, and not as many deaths as we saw, as well as infection rates. And then you had MERS, so Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. 2,500 people infected with a much higher death rate in something like this. But the interesting thing is we haven't seen these since 2002 and 2012. And if we have seen them, it's very little cases. And so basically there's a different value that we assign that I'll go over here in a minute. But then you look at something like severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. So this SARS-CoV-2 from 2019 is the COVID-19 that we are currently dealing with. Around 95.4 million people infected worldwide. And while the death rate is not as high as something like the MERS coronavirus, it is still very transmissible and can still be very deadly in certain populations. So then we also look at things, I mentioned the flu briefly. So something like H1N1, so the Spanish influenza outbreak in 1918, and then we had the swine flu outbreak in 2009. And you can see here, among all of the different pandemics, the 1918 Spanish influenza remains the deadliest beyond the Black Plague that hit the globe in the 14th century. So when you're looking at stuff like this, how can you say, well, this was so much more deadlier, and how does that translate if we're comparing apples and oranges, and how does this spread in the community? So the experts use something called R naught. So you can see here on the left side of the screen, I have a figure here, and it's this R with this little zero, and it's pronounced R naught, and it basically means a number that represents how quickly a contagious disease is spreading. So when you look at something like the H1N1 1918 virus, obviously we didn't have the technology that we do have now, but looking back at cases, looking back at accounts of everyone, they're estimating that the R naught of the H1N1 back in 1918 was between 1.4 to 2.8. So what does that mean? Essentially, if you have an R naught value less than 1, your disease or your pandemic is going to die out. If your R is equal to 1 or around 1, you're going to continue to see cases here and there, but you're not going to see pandemic proportions. When your R is greater than 1, this is when public health officials start to get a little bit worried. And this means that it's highly transmissible and it's a very contagious disease. So at 1.4 to 2.8, it was fairly transmissible and obviously fairly deadly as well. But then we look at something like our SARS-CoV-2, so the COVID-19 virus that we're currently dealing with today. Originally, when this first started, January, February, March, experts thought that it was between 2 to 3 was our R naught value. But what it's actually showing now is that the average is anywhere from the high 5s to 7. So what does that mean for you or I who's out in the public? I see my friend at the grocery store. If I'm not vaccinated, if I'm not wearing a mask, I'm not taking proper precautions, that means that I have the potential to infect anywhere from 5 to 7 people. And experts estimate this as highly underestimated for this virus. It's a highly transmissible virus. And it's hard for us to say exactly what the value is because we are doing things like wearing masks, trying to keep 6 feet away from people. There are currently people starting to be vaccinated. So it becomes hard to actually evaluate and come up with a number for this R naught value. But what it does tell you, it's a very transmissible disease. All right. So I know in the media, this is something that's very highly covered, comparing the 1918 Spanish influenza and the COVID-19 pandemic. And I really wanted to touch base with this because there are a few things that we can't exactly draw parallels to, but some things that we can consider for going forward. So essentially this presented in 3 different waves. The spring of 1918, very mild infection rates with low mortality rate. The fall of 1918 is where we saw a majority of the deaths. And something interesting about this compared to coronavirus, looking at things like coronavirus, we expect highest mortality or death rate to happen in those who are in the older populations or high risk categories. Interestingly enough, for the 1918 Spanish influenza, the highest death rate was actually 20 to 30-year-olds. So they especially saw this in soldiers who were returning from the war, and especially those traveling throughout Europe after the war. So this is one thing that I wanted to show, that we can't exactly draw that parallel. It's very different. And the other thing is that It started in 1918. It's called the Spanish influenza because it was first identified in Spain, but it's actually an H1N1 virus. So the flu that we see today, the flu that we saw in 2019 is a variant, or 2009 is a variant of it. So basically, they saw in countries between 1918 to 1920, this continued into the 1920s. And it never really stopped. We still see outbreaks of the flu as variants from the Spanish influenza. The 1950s, there was a few different strains that had outbreaks. The 1960s, there was a few different strains, and it just continues on. Dr. Fauci refers to this century kind of as the century of pandemics. In the last 100 years, it's never really stopped. We have these little blips along the way. And by far since 1918, the COVID-19 pandemic is a close third. So looking at it, the Spanish influenza caused 50 million deaths worldwide. Luckily, because of medical advances, wearing masks, doing quarantining, travel advisories, all sorts of things that we were able to do now, we were able to help stop some of the spread of the virus, as well as including treatment for COVID-19, so that our death rate is not that high, while it is still high. So these are just important things to remember as we draw parallels. Experts caution us to not draw exact parallels because the bottom line is the 1918 Spanish influenza is a completely different virus than coronavirus or COVID-19. So that's just one thing that I wanted to caution people as you guys are reading through the media. A lot of things are sometimes can be taken out of context. And I just want people to realize they are different viruses. And while public health officials have learned a lot from previous pandemics, they are not the same. So you can see here, I have a COVID-19 timeline. This is by no means an exhaustive list of everything that has happened in the last year, but these are some high points that I wanted to touch base on. So in December of 2019, the health commissioner in Wuhan, China, reported a cluster of pneumonia cases. So as we've seen with these COVID-19 patients, a lot of these end up being something like a pneumonia case. That is where they identified the novel coronavirus. So in the beginning, everyone referred to it as the novel coronavirus, and that is because it was a new strain compared to our normal coronavirus that we see every year. Then in January of 2020, the World Health Organization, or WHO, published their first community media release. So this was a big deal. WHO was recognizing this as something that was spreading. It was becoming a pandemic. The first cases were recorded outside of Wuhan, China. And right now, it's January 21st is the first confirmed case in the US. However, they have started to go back and look at some genetic tests, genetic sequencing of some of the samples that they had been getting back in December and January and February to see exactly when our first case was. And they suspect it was prior to January 21st. And interestingly enough, December to February between 2019 to 2020 had the highest kind of upper respiratory infection that most people have seen in a long time. And it could be that this virus was here a lot longer than we suspected. But one important thing I have bolded and highlighted there in red, genetic sequence of the COVID-19 virus was shared. So this is going to be very important for those who are concerned about how the vaccine came about so quickly. That genetic sequence is a very key piece to why the vaccine was able to be developed so quickly. Moving on to March and June, WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic. That's when we saw our quarantines go in place, travel restrictions. We saw all sorts of drugs being released under emergency use authorization. So that's that EUA that I have written there. And the death toll passes 100,000. So one thing that I do want to touch base on here, following the rest of the timeline, this is, in March to April and May, this is when we saw our public health experts like Dr. Acton and all these other people saying about hitting 100,000 cases a day, and we're trying to flatten the curve. And you can see later on in our timeline, so starting from July to October, we had a record number of cases, so 75,000 cases in one day. This is when we saw vaccines already developed, phase 1 and 2 trials already going on, and they were submitting their data to go further into phase 3 trials. And I know in the media, a lot of people have seen the more contagious strain of coronavirus. And actually, it's not so new. It was actually discovered back in September of 2020. Um, while it may be new today in the US, it was a contagious strain discovered back in September of 2020. And then, as I said, cases continue to grow, hospitalizations continue to grow. By November of 2020, we had hit a record-breaking 100,000 cases in a day. This is where we saw further drugs being approved for use under an EUA, so the emergency use authorization. And this was antibody treatment that I'll talk about a little bit later. And then finally, to end our 2020, Pfizer and Moderna both had their COVID-19 vaccines granted in EUA. So right here, the vaccine pipeline. So in drug manufacturing, all these different manufacturers, they have things called pipelines. And it's what you would expect. What is happening? What's coming down the line? What is about to be approved? So here's our vaccine pipeline. We currently have, you see here on the one side of the page on the red line I have down in the middle, I have Moderna and I have the Pfizer BioNTech. These are the two that are currently FDA approved with an emergency use authorization. So I'll talk a little bit more in detail about emergency use authorization, but I do think it's important to note this does not mean it is fully FDA approved. This was granted by the government due to the pandemic. So I'll explain a little bit more what that means later. These are both mRNA vaccines. You can see here their trials had similar participants. I really think it's important to note here that these participants in these trials are far more than the required number. You're looking at 10, 12 times more than the required number that someone may be required to have in a phase 3 trial. So they had included a lot of participants. You can see the efficacy. So how well does that vaccine work? 95% effective. They're both pretty comparable, and they're both 2 doses. And so that means you get your 1 dose, and then for Moderna, 28 days later, you get your second, and for Pfizer, 21 days later, you get your second dose. Looking at our other 2 that are coming down the pipeline. So we have here Johnson & Johnson, which I'm sure everyone has seen in the media. They just recently released some of their phase 1 and phase 2 trial data, but not exact numbers. So no EUA authorized yet. And this is a viral vector. So both them and AstraZeneca, you can see there what type of vaccine they are. They are viral vectors. So what is a viral vector? It sounds kind of weird, but essentially they take a part of the coronavirus and they allow it to mutate into a harmless virus, and they kind of attach it to another harmless virus, and then it kind of rides its way on into our body when we give the vaccine. So that's what a viral vector is. So these 2 vaccines are a little bit different than the 2 we already have approved. But same thing that we would expect with the mRNA, you cannot get the virus from it, even though they've taken part of it and put it on another one to give you. You would still not get the virus directly from the vaccine. So looking at this here, no published data yet for Johnson & Johnson. The big claim to fame for Johnson & Johnson is that it could be a 1-dose vaccine. Now, this is really up to the FDA and when this EUA may be given to them, and it all depends on their phase 3 trial data that they submit to the FDA. So it very well could be a 1-dose, but based off, looking at safety and how well it works, the FDA may decide to do 2 doses. Then we have the Oxford or the AstraZeneca trial. So I'm sure everyone has seen this. This has been going on in the UK for now a couple months now. No EUA here yet in the US. Also a viral vector vaccine with about 300,000 participants in their trial. And no published data yet here in the US. So we have the data that we've seen in the UK, but nothing that the FDA has released here or allowed for an EUA. And it's suspected that with these in the pipeline, anywhere from the next month or 2, depending on how quickly these companies move, to get these to the FDA and get them approved. AstraZeneca is also a 2-dose series. And one thing I did want to address with the AstraZeneca vaccine, so they, in the news and the media. They had been talking about just inconsistent dosing, and what had happened is in some of the trials, they had not quite given the full dose to some of their study participants. So it kind of leaves a question mark of how well does the vaccine work? The range that we see right now for AstraZeneca is anywhere from 60% to 90%. So hopefully their current and ongoing phase 3 trials help clear some of that up. All right, so let's get into the vaccine and let's get into some of these questions. So one of the biggest questions that I have had asked is, can you still receive the COVID vaccine after getting COVID? And the answer is yes. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, so the CDC, states patients can defer the vaccine until 90 days from the initial infection. And I'll kind of go over why that 90 days comes about. So you can see here on the left side of your screen here, you have your asymptomatic stage. That means you're just now getting the virus, you're starting to get your symptoms, and then we can see we begin to recover. Now, that's what happens on the outside of your body, but what happens on the inside of your body? So we have two things that happen on the inside of our body beyond us fighting the virus. We start to produce two different antibodies. One is called an IgM, so you can see right here on the screen between days 7 to 14, you have an IgM antibody that starts to become detectable. That is our short-term antibody. Then you see around day 14, we have an IgG antibody, and that is our long-term antibody. And you can see here, IgM kind of disappears after our acute illness has disappeared and when we're starting to feel better. But that's really when our long-term antibodies start to really ramp up here from day 14 to day 28. So this 90 days that they give a recommendation is there's no data, no evidence to support an actual time from when you're infected to when you should receive the vaccine. And the CDC realizes that, well, if I just had the infection a month ago, in 60 days, I may not know when my next vaccine will be available to me. So this is a huge question that I get asked all the time. Their recommendation is not a hard and fast, you absolutely cannot get it within 90 days. Their recommendation is you can wait 90 days if you'd like, because you have the lowest chance of reinfection rate within that 90 days. And that's because of this long-acting IgG that remains in your blood and provides long-term immunity. So that's why that 90 days kind of starts to come about. It's because of your antibodies. They're really starting to ramp up after you are recovering, and that's when you're protected the most. Now, this also means for people who do receive the COVID vaccine after they have been infected is you may very well have some mild side effects after you get your vaccine, after you get your first dose, because your body has already developed this IgG from the virus. So then when the vaccine is injected, it also realizes your immune system needs to start fighting again. So that's just something that we've noticed. So looking at COVID-19 and antibodies, I talked to you guys about lowest chance of reinfection within 90 days. The most important part is to wait until you're no longer actively sick. Make sure that you are pretty much recovered for the most part. The difficult thing with COVID-19 is that some of these symptoms can last for months. And this is where we really have to be careful and make sure you're not in the acute phase. So making sure you're no longer actively ill, you're feeling better, you're recovering, you're removed from isolation. And then that's when you can talk to your physician, talk to your healthcare provider about maybe it's time. Maybe I shouldn't wait 90 days, but I'm ready to get the vaccine now. So that's really where you want to involve your decision-making with your physician. And so that 90 days, that chance of reinfection, after 90 days, they aren't sure what happens. They aren't sure if you're still protected, if you still have some of the antibodies. And that's because you just have, in general, waning immunity. It's no different than some of the vaccines we get in our childhood, and they were to test my antibodies today, I likely wouldn't have them anymore. So just in general, waning immunity. And then something called the genetic drift. So the genetic drift, meaning that the virus may start to mutate and your antibodies may not cover that mutation. Now, if while you were sick, so say you had COVID-19, and then you received something called passive antibody therapy. So I'm sure in the news you guys have seen these. One's called bamlanivimab, and the other one is from Regeneron. And they didn't really give it a name. They still have it as their trial name. So it's a bunch of numbers with those letters. But it comes from the company. It's called Regeneron. So bamlanivimab and Regeneron, those are both passive antibody therapies that can be used as treatment for certain people who are infected with COVID-19. If you did receive any of those passive antibody therapy, the recommendation from the CDC is a hard and fast wait 90 days. And there's two reasons for this. They have unknown interference and safety with giving the vaccine as well as some antibody therapy. And then the other thing is the half-life. So I just talked about half-life of antibodies looking about 90 days out. So bamlanivimab and Regeneron are, passive antibody therapy. So their recommendation is to wait 90 days following the infusion of one of those drugs. And it's important to note here, it does not include any other non-COVID antibody treatments. So there may be those of you out there who receive IV immunoglobulin for some other immune condition, or if you receive RhoGAM injections, anything like that, that's not included in that recommendation of 90 days. So now we're looking at consent forms. I know a lot of people, they see all these different questions that the CDC is asking, all these different screening questions. They become a little concerned and they get a little disheartened and they think they can't get the vaccine anymore. And I want everyone to know that may not be true. You may still qualify to receive the vaccine, even if you check yes to one of those screening questions. And that's why it's so important to have this conversation with your healthcare provider. So in here, I included just a general, very plain CDC checklist or screening form that they have published. So even the CDC right here, you can see if you answer yes to any question, it does not necessarily mean you should not be vaccinated. This is very important to remember because there are a lot of questions on here that people may check yes to. So our first question on here, are you feeling sick today? So looking at this, are you feeling sick today? What this means is that for a normal illness, there's no evidence that supports receiving a vaccine while you're sick will reduce how well the vaccine works or will increase your chance of side effects. But in general, it's recommended to wait to be vaccinated until after you're no longer sick. So same thing if you have COVID-19, always should wait. If you have something that's beyond just a mild illness, you should be waiting until the actual sickness is over and you're recovering. You don't want to overload your immune system. You want your immune system to be able to respond well to the vaccine and get those antibodies produced. And one thing, so this is the question, they never elaborate on these screening tools, but mild illness does not count. Being on antibiotics does not count. So if you just have a minor cough, an upset stomach, something that's very mild, minor, it does not disqualify you from receiving the vaccine. And this is where you should always talk to your healthcare provider if you have any questions about those. Especially if you're on like chronic antibiotics or you were just getting over a minor sinus infection and you're on antibiotics, anything like that really does not disqualify you from the CDC's perspective. So make sure you guys are talking to your healthcare providers and making sure if you have questions about whether or not you are considered in this sick category, and make sure that you get talking to them. So next on there, I kind of grouped these together, so bear with me here. Have you ever had an allergic reaction to a component of the COVID-19 vaccine, including polyethylene glycol, polysorbate, or any previous dose of the COVID-19 vaccine? And then also any allergic reactions to another vaccine other than the COVID-19 vaccine or an injectable medication. And then something like anaphylaxis to any component or any other vaccine. So you can see here, this includes food, pet, environmental, or oral medication allergies. So this does not mean you cannot get it. The CDC gives very good recommendations here of helping your healthcare providers and having this discussion with them. So make sure you start that discussion with them early on and before you're ready to get your vaccine. So polyethylene glycol, other known as PEG, is a compound used in laxatives, cosmetics. It's used as thickening agents in many different products. And you can see here that it is in both of the current vaccines that are approved. And this is part of, it's not an active ingredient. So the active ingredient is our mRNA in there, but this is part of the inactive piece. And interestingly enough, they have found some allergies to this PEG. So the CDC recommendation is that a severe allergy to PEG, polysorbate, or any of the components that are listed on the screen are a contraindication to receiving this vaccine. So this is really where, if you have allergies like this, severe allergies, where you should be talking to your allergist, your immunologist, anybody that you see for your allergies. But it's another thing to note that severe allergies to other vaccines, injectables, oral medications, pets, environmental allergens, and venom are not contraindications. These are considered precautions by the CDC. And this is important to know. I know I had a lot of questions of people saying, well, when I have a procedure done, I have a really bad reaction to the Versed or the fentanyl, or, oh, I'm allergic to penicillin. These are things that we really should be, asking before we get the vaccine. It's always good to ask about allergies, but this is something of a precaution that we should be talking to our healthcare provider about. So this is the biggest question of them all. I have a lot of allergies. Am I able to still receive the vaccine? So yes, the CDC only refers to a severe reaction to PEG, polysorbate, or other components in the vaccine as a contraindication. Now, I want to bring up this slide right here, and you can take a look here. Most of the public falls into this green category that I have the arrow pointing to, where you're allergic to something like amoxicillin, penicillin, and it really does not have to do with any of the components that are in the vaccine. Always good to note, always good to let your healthcare provider know. But typically you're in the green. They may observe you for about 30 minutes instead of 15 minutes. And then those who fall into the yellow category should always check, like I said, I've been really harping on checking with your physician and conduct a risk versus benefit analysis. And what that means is, is it better for you to risk possibly having a severe reaction, or is it going to be worse for you to get COVID-19? So these are really conversations you have to start early with your healthcare provider and make sure you're not waiting till you're going through this screening and bringing it up to them. All right. Have you ever received a vaccine in the last 14 days? So this one is really just has to do with this vaccine wasn't tested with other vaccines. So the recommendation from the CDC is to space these out 14 days apart. Really, really important to remember that these vaccines have 2 doses. So I know this time of year, a lot of pneumonia vaccines, a lot of Shingrix vaccines, even people getting their hepatitis B, Tdap, preparing for outside in the springtime. We want to make sure that you are not scheduling vaccines anytime around getting either your first or your second dose. So, don't go get your COVID vaccine and then schedule your pneumonia vaccine 14 days later, because you still have to get your second dose. So make sure you are definitely watching that and making sure you're not scheduling any vaccines around that time. And then we discussed these 2 already, number 7 and 8. Have you ever had a positive test, and have you received passive antibody therapy? All right, so our next one here, I'm going to group number 9 and 10 together. So do you have a weakened immune system? Do you take any immunosuppressive drugs? And do you have a bleeding disorder, or are you taking a blood thinner? So the CDC recommendations for both of these, basically immunosuppression means that your immune system does not have as large of a response. So there's a lot of conditions that can contribute to that, as well as medications. So conditions like HIV, cancer, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, MS, and a lot of these are often mediated by medications used as treatment. So things like chemotherapy, you may have heard of things like Solaris or Humira, all those different commercials you see on TV for these monoclonal antibodies. All of these things start to suppress the immune system. And so for these people, it can be a timing thing of this is when you should really talk to your provider, especially if you're getting things like cycles of chemotherapy. This is when you want to talk to your provider and ask them, when is the best time for me to get this vaccine? People who are immunosuppressed have a higher risk of getting COVID-19 and a higher risk of having a more severe case because your immune system is not up to par sometimes. So the CDC recommends vaccination of those, but like I said, the timing is often the issue, and this is where you should really include your physicians in your decision making of when to get the vaccine. For blood thinners, the CDC recommends moving forward with vaccination for those on blood thinners or having a blood disorder. And it may not be why you think why that question is on there. Why that question is on there actually has to do with the injection itself and not actually the vaccine. So the injection obviously is going through your skin, it's going through the muscle, and it's going into your body. People who have bleeding disorders and who are on blood thinners often bruise easier, they're bleeding a little easier. So you just want to make sure you check with your physician, ask them, hey, am I stable on my warfarin? Am I stable on my Xarelto? Do you think my bleeding disorder is stable enough to get an injection? So these are things that we definitely need to be checking with beforehand, but not necessarily a contraindication. And then the last one on that screening, are you pregnant or breastfeeding? So I wanted to, again, state this is a decision made to the patient and their physician. And it's important to note there's no safety data for or against receiving the vaccine for pregnant or lactating women. Studies have shown that pregnant women tend to have a higher risk of a more severe COVID-19 infection. And typically when that progresses and things like intubation and being on a ventilator, that's when we start to see a higher mortality as well. So the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and then the Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine, they recommend a risk versus benefit analysis be completed. So you can see there I have listed 4 things that those societies really want patients to discuss with their physicians. And a lot goes into this decision and it's not taken lightly. And it doesn't necessarily mean they shouldn't get the vaccine, but it's a decision that the patient and the physician need to make together and make sure it's best for both parties involved. And a lot of times this makes it even harder because pregnant women are not included in vaccine studies or really drug trials at all. So the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine advocates for pregnant and lactating women to be added into the continuing COVID-19 vaccine trials. And their reasoning is that the recently approved Ebola vaccine, which can be given in pregnancy, it works similarly as a viral vector vaccine, so like something like Johnson & Johnson or AstraZeneca, to the COVID-19 vaccine. So will the COVID-19 vaccine change my DNA? This is a myth. The vaccine cannot change your DNA. So mRNA technology. So looking through here, mRNA is basically a set of instructions for your body. Without mRNA, our body is essentially useless. It kind of gives our body instructions to do every simple life function. And every single protein that the mRNA makes has a specific job in our body. So it's called technology because we've never really had a vaccine like this. Most are either live or inactive versions. It's been studied for decades, but never really used in a vaccine. But it's technology because it uses genetic sequencing of that disease and targets that specifically. So then by putting it in our body, it allows natural biologic mechanisms in the body to fight off disease after vaccination. So for the COVID-19 vaccine, that mRNA produces something called a spike protein, and it just produces part of it, just enough to get our body to respond to it and create antibodies. But essentially, the mRNA never enters the center of the cell where our DNA is stored. It's kind of a misconception because it does enter the cell of the virus, but never our cells. So it never has contact with our DNA. So you can see that here in the center, I have this DNA right here in the nucleus of the cell. And you can see outside of that is where the mRNA vaccine goes. So it never enters our nucleus or has contact with our DNA. So my friend tested positive after receiving the vaccine. They must have gotten COVID from the vaccine. This is a myth. You cannot get COVID from the COVID-19 vaccine. So a few questions here. You cannot get COVID from the vaccine And then will the vaccine cause me to test positive if I went to get a test? So you may experience some similar symptoms after receiving the vaccine. This is completely normal. This is an expected side effect. And most of those symptoms dissipate after 3 days. Those who test positive after receiving the vaccine, it's likely that their antibodies hadn't been built up yet. So maybe it's within like a 14-day window of receiving the vaccine, or they were already incubating the virus prior to receipt of the vaccine. And the vaccine will not cause a positive COVID-19 test. So even for both types of tests, it will not cause a positive test to occur. The positive test that you may see is an antibody test. So if you get tested for antibodies after vaccination, it will detect the spike protein. So we talked about that antibody, IgM and IgG. So if you take an antibody test and you do have positive IgM and IgG, that's good. That means the vaccine's working and you have antibodies. Does the COVID-19 vaccine cause infertility? This is a misconception. One thing that I really want to touch on here is that this is obviously a very sensitive subject of whether or not it causes infertility. There's no guarantee just because the trials have not gone that long, but what they've seen so far in the trials, there's nothing to support the claim. So the claim came from Wolfgang Wodarg. He is a German physician, and he had claimed that the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine attacked a similar protein, or it would cause the body to attack a similar protein in the placenta that is similar to the spike protein. And it's important to note that this physician specifically had also spoken out pretty globally about vaccination during other pandemics. So this is not his first time doing this. And experts compare that. So it's a very small sequence of genetic material that the spike protein that the body is going to be trained to attack and the protein of that placenta. So experts kind of compare this to if my number has a number 7 in it, the other number may have a number 7 into it, and that's number 7 as well. So it's a very small stretch and almost insignificant. And Wodarg himself had said there's no indication whether antibodies against spike proteins of the virus would attack it. So even himself, he didn't know. This is all very theoretical. Nothing in the current studies support this. And it's really hard for this kind of claim to come about because clinically infertility is something that you don't typically consider, saying someone is infertile until 2 years after starting to try. So pregnant women were excluded from the study, but interestingly enough, 23 women in the Pfizer study became pregnant during the study. And one thing that is, to combat this theoretical logic that Wodarg had said was experts are saying that, 20% of the population, maybe even higher, maybe even 3 times higher, have been infected, yet there has been no difference in fertility patterns that physicians have been able to see or experts have been able to see. So if I get vaccinated, I don't have to wear masks anymore. This is a misconception. So here I have, how well do these vaccines work? So what is their efficacy? And it's important to note here that I have, how many participants were in their studies. The primary endpoint was confirmed COVID-19, but that included having a symptom. So what that means is they only looked at people who had symptomatic COVID-19, and it worked very, very well in preventing symptomatic COVID-19. So 95% effectiveness for Pfizer after 2 doses, 52% after 1 dose. And Moderna 94% after 2 doses and around 90% already after 1 dose. After 2 doses works very well against symptomatic COVID-19. But what they didn't look at was studies did not evaluate asymptomatic spread. So while I may have gotten the vaccine and I feel well, I don't have symptomatic COVID, I could still be a carrier and I could still bring it home. And this is a very, very important thing to remember. As the rest of everyone else is starting to get vaccinated and not everyone is vaccinated, masks still need to be worn, even as people start to get vaccinated. And this is so, so, so important if we want to start recovering from this pandemic. These vaccines were developed quickly. They can't be safe. This is also a misconception. So here is a vaccine timeline, and you can see here it takes on average anywhere from 10 to 15 years. And basically what happened was it just squishes it all left to make it a much smaller timeline. So here's another look. This, you can see basic research, discovery of the molecule, all these different trials, FDA review, and post-monitoring. And so this on average takes anywhere from 10 to 15 years, with the quickest so far being 5 years. So everyone's asking, how did this happen with COVID-19? Is it safe? So you can see here on the top, I have a normal timeline, and on the bottom, I have a COVID-19 vaccine timeline. And remember, I brought up that January of 2020, they had already had the genetic sequence of that virus. This was so key to the development of the vaccine. And the other two things that really contributed to this was, having government involved, money, contracts. That's one thing that really pushed this to go quicker. And then the other thing is collaboration. If those initial scientists who had found the initial sequence had never shared it with other companies, with other scientists, there is no way this would have come out as quickly as it did. So collaboration, getting that genetic sequence really early on, this was key to having the vaccine developed quickly. And then some things to also notice is they did not follow patients as long as they normally would. So you can see here that the phases for a normal is 5 to 7 years for clinical trials. These were only about 6 months, and at minimum, they followed people for 2 months. They will be continuing these trials. So these trials are still going on, and they will for 2 more years. And basically they had to show their safety and their efficacy, and then the FDA can grant them their emergency use authorization. So here are some safety profiles. So the most common for Pfizer, is injection site reaction. So what does that mean? A sore arm, maybe a red mark on your arm. It could maybe itch a few days later. So an injection site reaction was the most common. Most people started to feel these other symptoms after their second dose because your body had already had an immune response. So you may have some chills, you may be a little bit more tired after your second dose, but it's no worse than something like having a second dose of your Shingrix. And for Moderna as well, the most common adverse reaction was also pain at the injection site. So about 92% of people, and again, right there on that second dose, that's when you may feel your fatigue, your headache, things like that. But for the most part, these are pretty well tolerated vaccines, and their side effects are something we expect with normal vaccines. So I'm young, getting COVID won't be too bad. I'll have natural immunity and I'm not high risk. This is a myth. While most deaths occur in elderly populations, there can be long-lasting health effects. So there's a discussion between natural immunity versus vaccines. Some natural immunity may provide more immunity than some vaccines, but a lot of times you have to weigh the safety as well as things like the cost on the healthcare system. On average, for someone who's 20 to 30 years old to be hospitalized with COVID-19, it costs around $40,000. And that's for a 20 to 30-year-old who probably has a short stay. So this is stuff that you really have to consider. If the vaccine's being offered to you, and this is why it's being rolled out the way it is, it allows you to reduces your risk of long-term health conditions and hospitalization, reduces that cost. So with the chickenpox vaccine introduced in 1995, hospitalizations and death decreased by 90% after introducing that vaccine. So things like this are very important to consider. The long-term health conditions from COVID-19 can really leave long-lasting damage. So respiratory failure, scarred lungs, even mood disorders, depression, difficulty concentrating, thinking, and long-term effects on your heart and your kidneys. So some quick facts really quick. Can you get another manufacturer for your second dose? As of now, you should be getting the same manufacturer for your first and second doses. Is one dose enough immunity? People who only received one dose in the trial studies were not followed further. So the FDA cannot say if it works just as well to get one dose. I'm not available 21 days or 28 days from now. What do I do? The CDC recommends receiving the first or the second dose plus or minus 4 days from that initial due date. If you fall outside the window, it's not recommended to get another vaccine. So you don't get a third vaccine if you fall outside that window. You just get it when you're able to the next time. And so this is a big question. Why are only certain people receiving the vaccine? The way the government has rolled this out is to hit the highest risk population, as well as those with higher death rates. And then they will continue to roll this out to the public. And who will the vaccine be available through? So the health departments, physician offices, hospitals, rural health centers, federally qualified health centers, and pharmacies. Specifically in Ohio, you'll see this a lot more at pharmacies around the area. So always just keep in contact with the health department, watch their Facebook, watch their websites. Make sure that you guys are asking who's getting these vaccines and where can I find it? How can I get on that list?